You mentioned Ray Holland. Tell us about the Holland Manifesto.
Well, one of the things that the 4 years generated for all of us was a degree of excitement, challenge, and frustration. And the frustration centered on the progress path that we were on. Many of us realized, watching Terry Coleman and Larry Walker and Tom Buck, and these guys who've been in the legislature for over 20 years finally get their committee chairmanships and are still hanging there waiting to ascend to the ultimate leadership post. And we're going like, I'm not going to be here 20 years. I want to actually get more involved now. So we started thinking about ways in which we could improve the mechanics of the House. And so Ray stayed focused on this. And we did several things, like, we all were early adopters of computers. We got elected because we used databases on these little new fancy things that were being used out there. And we got computers. And we asked to have those used to have ready access to information. Secondly, we had a degree of expectation on what legislation before us would be evaluated before we voted on it. Frequently a bill would get introduced, sent to committee, voted out of committee that afternoon, and it was on its fast track. It's on the floor a couple days later. You really haven't had a chance to study it, to vet it, to have public hearings. We just didn't think that was right. We felt like there are a lot of issues where we ought to put them out there early, let people debate them, have public sessions before we come into this abbreviated 40-day session and get it all done there. Some of us even felt like we ought to split the session into two parts. You could only introduce bills the first 20 days, take a 30-day break, and do the other 20 days broken into two pieces of 10 and 10 so that you could vet, have hearings on, and actually evaluate these bills before you actually passed them all the way through the process. Many nights on the last night of the session, it was a nightmare for the voters of Georgia, because things that passed in the middle of the night with amendments in a conference committee report that nobody except the people who wrote it had ever read. And it's very frustrating, and we felt like that reform needed to be included. We did several things, but Ray Holland reduced them to writing. He focused on it, and just after I left office, they started pursuing these reforms after the couple of battles that we fought that I'm sure you'll want to talk a little bit about. With retail divorcement and then the ethics and government.
Yeah, well, let's talk about them now. You had several measures there, as I recall, ethics among them. You had some environmental legislation.
Well, I grew up on the coast. Environmental issues were important to us. I had a natural ally in Doug Teeper. He was an environmental activist. That was his role before he came to the legislature. I wasn't crazed about it. I wasn't a wild-eyed liberal environmental activist. I had major employers in my community, Sea Island Company, their major employer. I had Hercules, Georgia Pacific ultimately. Major employers in my community, but the balance between the environmental sensitivity, we live in a very delicate environmental situation with the rivers and the marshes and the estuaries. It's very important for us to protect those marshlands. But at the same time, we had 800 jobs at one facility, 1,500 jobs at one, 1,200 at the other. And my challenge and my job was to represent my constituents. The last thing I wanted to do was put one of these companies out of business because of a simple environmental regulation. But at the same time, I wanted to protect the environment, because the beauty of the Golden Isles is well known. And it's well known because we've protected it to some degree. Once Hercules and Georgia Pacific in their reign in Glenn County, that's going to be a total 100% tourist economy. Well, we can't yet afford that. And so we have to pay the bills, and this pays the bills and keeps people fed and keeps jobs in the community. Even our hometown boy, Pete Correll, grew up in Brunswick. He went on to run Georgia Pacific and in a terrific way, relocated the company to Georgia, and it's a wonderful success story, and he still lives in the Golden Isles. He in addition to splitting time in Atlanta, he still lives on Sea Island in a house that we built. Fennel Construction Company built the house that he ended up buying from one of the Jones family members that we built it for. But the fact that I wanted to get involved. I was very interested in the river protection component, and there were several folks who had been working on this for years. So I came late to the party, but I was happy to be on the Natural Resources Committee, which I requested, and working with them to help fashion a bill. And Miller on the Senate side had a bill that was the Mountain Protection Act. And he felt very strongly coming from the mountains about that. So those two bills were merged ultimately in what became the River and Mountain Protection Act. And I was proud to be one of those who were co-signers on the beginning, and I sat on the committee that helped with the final versions of those bills. And it just was important. Natural resources was important to all of us. Mm-hmm. I served on Defense and Veterans Affairs. Didn't quite understand why I was appointed that, but it was one of the junior committees. I happened to enjoy it. McCracken Poston and I got a chance to serve on that. We studied the civil defense component. We actually learned about earthquakes. I don't know if you know, but Georgia has many earthquakes a year, minor tremors. But we got to go to Louisville, Kentucky to see the civil defense bunker just down the street from the state capitol underground. We've since instituted an awful lot of those things in Georgia for emergency conditions, and Georgia has a pretty extensive defense network and a civil defense component to what we do. Not many people talk about it, but Buzz Weiss could probably help you out on that. But that was one of the committees. But the one that I coveted most, and the Speaker was very kind to appoint me to, was the Transportation Committee. Because transportation was important to the whole state, but it was important to my area for two reasons. One, we had some small road issues with bridges, crossing over railroad tracks, crossing over these rivers to get to St. Simons and Jekyll Island. And we needed some state help to get these done. But the biggest one, we had been stymied by a political decision that had been made back in the 40s and 50s. And that was the location and construction of the Sidney Lanier Bridge across the Brunswick River. It was assured that Savannah as a port would grow and Brunswick would not by the location and the structure that was placed across that river. And I was going to make sure that if I had anything to do with it, before I left my time in public service, we would alter that opportunity and give Brunswick a chance to at least compete and breathe. And I'll go back to 1986. I remember when Reverend Tillman was running to get his third nomination. He had defeated me, and there was a fundraiser held at the Elks Lodge. Tom Murphy came down to help raise money for Reverend Tillman, and he stood in this hall, and 80 some odd Democrats gathered there to support the Reverend. And he said, "Folks, until you guys send me a Democrat, I can't really help you with any of your issues. So y'all better elect him." We didn't. 2 years later, fast forward, I win the election the next morning when Tom Murphy arrived at the state capitol with his Stetson and a cigar. I was sitting in his office waiting. He said, "Son, happy to see you. Congratulations. Saw where you won." I said, "Yes, sir, Mr. Speaker." He said, "So what is it you want?" He was very straightforward and very blunt about things like that. And if he told you something, it was bankable. And I said, "Mr. Speaker, it's just a little old bridge." And he smiled. He said, "I figured that's what it was. Let's see what we can do about it." I said, "Mr. Speaker, we've raised $2 million in commitments locally through the chamber and through the local governments. We can get more if we need to, but we wanted to come to the table with something besides just an ask and an emissary." And he said, "Well, I appreciate that. That helps a lot. We're going to work on it." And true to his word, he and Zell Miller made this happen for my community. There's a new bridge spanning that river, the Sidney Lanier Bridge Reborn. And it was a challenge. We worked for an awful long time and among a lot of folks. And I said, "Mr. Speaker, what do you need me to do? I'm a soldier here. You tell me what you need me to do." He said, "I need 100% of your delegation to vote for the budget." "Yes, sir, Mr. Speaker. I'm on it." Well, I had a Republican in my delegation named Willow Smith, a wonderful lady. Copeland was her maiden name. Her grandfather was the Coca-Cola bottler locally, so she never really had to do anything. Public service was a calling, and she owned some Burger King franchises among other business interests, and her husband worked at Sea Island. Great people, and she was a true public servant and a great friend. But she was a Republican. And Johnny Isakson, her leader in the caucus, made sure that no budget was being voted for by Republicans. It was a consistent pattern. Every year the Democrats propose a budget, the Republicans are going to vote against the budget every time. And it was almost unanimous every time. This one was different. And I'll never forget the day the vote occurred on the budget. I'm sitting in the back row, second to the back row, the old sawmill gang as it was called. And Willou sat on the opposite side of the aisle, third row from the back. And Johnny Isakson, of course, the Republican leader, sat closer to the front on the aisle on the other side. And the speaker said, "All members voted? All members voted." We were all watching the board, and Willou's light was not yet lit. And the speaker was looking. I was looking at her. Johnny was looking down, and he was looking up at the board. And Willou put her head on her desk and put her finger on the green button as I was 2 paces away from my desk and as Johnny was 2 paces away from his desk. We were both headed for her, and she voted green, and the speaker said, "The clerk will lock the machine," and it was done.
Done deal.
And I met my commitment, Willou met her commitment, and we got our bridge in Brunswick. And Tom Murphy and Zell Miller and Terry Coleman and guys like that helped make that happen.
That's very interesting.
Yes.
Let's talk a minute about ethics.
Okay.
Your four horsemen had some ethics legislation, as I recall, that might have ruffled a few feathers in the House of Representatives.
Well, you know, we were a different breed, these young guys, and I had seen things happen. The first time I ever met Tom Murphy, for example, I had seen him from afar, but I was working for Zell across the way, and I went to my very first Jefferson Jackson dinner in 1980. The day of the event, everybody's buzzing, we're going to the event, we're going to the event. Well, I'm just a junior staffer on Zell's staff. I didn't have a ticket. Heck, I didn't have a tux. I only a couple of suits. So Cap Hicks said about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, he said, "Son, you got a ticket for tonight's event?" I said, "No, sir, I don't." He said, "You do now." And he handed me a ticket. I was just over the moon. I'm going to the Jefferson Jackson, and I had no idea what to expect. So I go to this event. I show up a little early because I realized when I got to the check-in, everybody had a numbered table. You're supposed to know where you're sitting. Mine didn't have a number on it. Cap had just handed me this random ticket. So I walk in, and I'm looking around for Cap to find out where my seat is. And as I walked in, Tom Murphy walked in the side door. And he walked over to where his table was, and he put something down there. And I said, "Hello, Mr. Speaker." And he said, "Son?" I said, "Have you seen Cap Hicks?" He said, "No." I said, "I'm just looking for my seat. I don't know where I'm supposed to sit." He said, "You don't have a seat?" I said, "Well, I've got a ticket, but I don't know where I'm supposed to sit." He said, "My wife wasn't feeling well tonight. She's not coming. Why don't you just sit here with me?" So my eyes bugged out. I'm not going to tell the man no. He's very kind to offer me a seat for his sick wife. So I dutifully plopped my butt down right there. Well, Miller comes in about a half an hour, 40 minutes later, sitting at a table, next table over, and, everybody's eating their salad, and he looks up and he looks over at me and he raised it up and looked at me like that, and I went like that, and he just shook his head. We never talked about it. But I told Cap later, I said, "I got this ticket this seat because the speaker asked me to sit down." Well, I tell you that story and to lead up to the ethics debate because I found the man to be polite, congenial, somewhat shy, a bit of an introvert, which was different than the public persona I had read about and seen and heard about through the rantings out of Miller's mouth, which was part of how that dynamic worked across the House and the Senate. But I had the opportunity that first couple of years to go through an awful lot of changes. We all did. We were taken out to dinner and out to lunch and different things, and a lot of people showered an awful lot of attention on us and a lot of benefit. Ken and I were invited down to the Masters by the phone company, and the oil companies before we even got elected, brought us into town to the Ritz-Carlton, took us down to the races. Texaco put us up in their private suite. We got to go down on the track and meet Davey Allison and Richard Petty, and you go down the list, they were all there, and we got to do that, and it was very heady stuff. Well, what we didn't know is we were being curried favor relative to protecting their interests. It's logical, but we just didn't realize it at the time. And we didn't realize we'd have to end up being on an issue, having to decide between various parties. And Ken had an issue with a local constituent problem with a guy who was a gas dealer selling fuel, and he was competing with a company store not far away. And so Ken was asked to try to make this right. Well, a lot of people got involved in this issue after Ken introduced his simple little bill to help his constituent. And they beat up an awful lot of people and tried to divide an awful lot of people and spent a ton of money. We didn't realize at the time how much or what they were spending money on, but after the fact, we heard these wild numbers, well over $1 million being spent on this one issue, on this one bill by the various constituencies, the association that represented all the oilmen and each of the oil companies, and it was bizarre. Ken and I went down to, when I say Ken, McCracken Poston, we call him Ken. He uses the last 3 letters of his first name. But we went down and Ken was asked to speak on the retail divorcement issue at a conference at Ponte Vedra, Sawgrass Resort. So we went down there, and we were each dating at the time. So we had an outing down on the coast. In the bar on Saturday night after his speech, after we had done all of our glad handing, they were having a special on mudslides. I don't know it's a chocolate liqueur, heavy layered drink. And we drank those till we got sick. Well, the next morning he was supposed to meet me for a foursome to play golf, and he didn't show. Well, when we made the turn, I came to check in. He was sick as a dog, and he ended up coming home that evening, and they admitted him straight to the hospital, and he was diagnosed diabetic. I nearly killed one of my best friends with this chocolate overdose that night and didn't realize it, and he didn't realize he was diabetic until that moment. But while he was recovering from this almost diabetic coma that we had put him in with these chocolate drinks, he started thinking about, because it was a life or death situation. They said, you were about to go blind. If you had not watched this, you could have been 3 more months. You'd have been irreversible. And so it scared all of us, him mostly, but it helped us understand some things. He had been getting assertive and challenging communications from folks. We're going to cut you off from going to these fun events, and you're going to be just banished and all this stuff. And so it started affecting him. Well, bottom line, he got a version of that bill passed, but while he went through all that and the health issues, it gave him a greater sense of where he was in life and what he wanted really to accomplish. And the fact that they were spending so much money on one issue, on one bill, and nobody knew how much, there was no reporting, he felt like it was crucial that we have some sort of reporting requirement, a basic ethics law where people could have some degree of confidence, create a committee that looked into challenges, and go out and tell the world that Georgia has this on the books. This person is trying to influence these legislators. They're spending this amount of money. If it's just dinner or a drink or whatever, it's fine. Just tell us what it is. We'll make up our own mind. So it wasn't nefarious. It was pretty straightforward. We thought it was sensible as the Young Turks. Yeah, ethics are important. Why wouldn't anybody be for ethics in government? Well, when he introduced this bill, there were a lot of folks who thought it was radioactive. They weren't going to touch it because they were disrupting the way of life. And I was a little reluctant at first, to be honest, because there are a lot of us who had hoped to be in the House for a number of years, and we wanted to work our way up the chain and be leadership positions as well. But it was obvious to me, I had been a Miller loyalist, so I wasn't going to be on Tom Murphy's priority list, Not that that was a bad thing, but it was obvious. And then secondly, you know, when you're in the legislature and you're impatient like we were, they were more technical, strategic, and legislators. They wanted to pass bills. I wanted to help my folks. And I was less about writing laws than trying to repeal some. In fact, they chuckled at me whenever I told them that I thought we ought to, for every bill we introduced, we ought to repeal 2 laws until we ultimately can put ourselves out of business by having the one, you know, do unto others as you'd have them do unto you, and we'd be finished with the legislature. We wouldn't need this anymore. Yeah, they said, that's going to work. They're a non-lawyer, so they just dismissed me right out. That's fine. But Ken asked me, and I agreed to sign on. I'm the number 2 signer on the Ethics in Government Act. Ken took the bullets, the arrows, and led the way. I merely signed on and supported him the whole way. I gave a talk on the floor of the House. It was brief, but I showed support, and I even quoted Spike Lee, who was popular at that time with a movie that had just come out, and ended it with, just do the right thing. It was very straightforward. A reporter, an opinion maker for the local publication here in Atlanta, who's still working to this day, wrote a couple of paragraphs about my making remarks, and he attributed, he used the word bunk, like I had said virtually nothing and it meant nothing. He didn't bother to look that I was the number 2 signer on the bill. He thought I was just electioneering out of it. But nonetheless, that was the year I ran for Congress in 1992. But the Ethics in Government Act changed the way people looked at the legislature, at the leadership structure, and at how we interface with the lobbying community. A lot of really good people out in the halls who were telling their client's story, and all we were asking them to do was just put on the record what you're spending. We don't care how much it is. We're not asking for limits. We just want you to tell the public what you're doing.
You mentioned Murphy and Miller. Tell us about your experiences with our extinguished Lieutenant Governor and Murphy's mausoleum.
Well, let me give you one story from early on that I don't get a chance to tell. We're all freshmen. We're being feted by the speaker and the leadership. He sends word down, the 3 of us, Ken, Ray, and Ron. Speaker wants you to go to lunch with him today. So we jump in the car with Butch, who is the driver and the speaker, and we go to the Commerce Club. We sit in one of the little alcoves over there with our friend from Savannah's Mills picture on the wall. And we listen to Butch and he and one other fellow who had walked up chat about various issues, and then we talk about almost nothing the whole time. Have a nice lunch, eat our ice cream. We get in the car, and on the way back, I'm sitting in the right side, and Ray Holland's in the middle, and Ken's on the other side, and the speaker says, you know, I think we ought to get Ray to go fishing with us this weekend, talking to Butch. And the speaker didn't think anything more about it, and Ray in the back perks up and said, me, Mr. Speaker? He said, no, Ray Goff. Talking about the coach. So we gave Ray a pretty hard time about that, still do to this day. But he said, can you talk to that friend of yours? You talking to me, Mr. Speaker? Yeah, that friend of yours across the hall. Can you talk to him? I said, what you want me to talk to him about, Mr. Speaker? We were just getting out of the car at the Capitol. He said, come on in my office and I'll talk to you. And so just the 2 of us go into his office, and he gives me the message he wants me to deliver to Miller. And I'm going like, okay, there's a phone over there. Why don't you just pick up, I'm thinking to myself, why don't you just pick up the phone and call him? No, dutifully, yes sir, Mr. Speaker. And down I go, downstairs and over to the Lieutenant Governor's office. And I said, Martha, I'm here to see the chief. And she said, well, he's on the phone, but he'll be off in a minute. I said, okay, I'll wait. So I waited. Said, okay, he'll see you now. I go in there. I said, Chief, I don't know what this means, if anything, but I had lunch with Tom Murphy today, and he sent me over here to deliver a message, and here it is. So I delivered the message, and he says, "You tell Tom Murphy," and I said, hey, I'll tell him whatever you want, but I don't work for you anymore. I'm not on the staff. I'm an elected official. You tell Tom Murphy. So I had to become the relay guy that session because these two stubborn mules would not talk to one another on the phone. It's just one of those interesting moments that I had a chance and a privilege to be a part of. The two guys were so much alike, it was scary. Two old guard Southern Democrats, come from families where they had challenged circumstances growing up, but achieved beyond all measure of the obstacles in their way. Both had a feeling that the little guy needed fighting for, who, as North Georgians, I mean, the speaker was proud of going to North Georgia College and how he fought often to protect their interest and to grow the school and the legend behind it, and Miller about young Harrison. It was really a fun thing to watch the two of them very much alike, not getting along. Mm-hmm. But they ran the chambers. I mean, I watched Zell. I used that number 4 earlier. 4 votes. I served 4 years under Miller, 4 years at the Democratic Party, 4 years in the House, and 4 years at a trade association afterwards. And it seems like 4 is a common theme. But those two guys fought one another over the simplest things, and they ran each chamber virtually the same in some respects. I think Zell regretted his early days where he gave more power out to other folks, but he had seen what had happened prior to him, and he ultimately regained control, and Murphy kept control on his side of the aisle.
Don't you find it interesting that the current Republican Senate has done the same thing to the lieutenant governor?
Yes.
As Miller gave up freely
Yes.
when he was lieutenant governor?
It's very odd what's happened this time around, because a similar group did this, as you recall, to Mark Taylor when he became lieutenant governor, took the power of committee appointments and even assignment of bills away. Mark became a figurehead presiding officer and standing for photo ops. And it was very awkward. And I think this group of Republican leaders, there may be one in there who wants to challenge Casey for the nomination the next time around for governor, and they want to thwart his ability to reach the big chair. Fine. Mm-hmm. But there's an ambition in the group, but there's also a fear that they're all going to be brought down by some people's failings, and they watch some things that the outgoing governor has done that they haven't liked, and that the lieutenant governor was involved with that they didn't like. They're a little frightened at the news stories surrounding the existing governor, and they feel that domino effect might just spoil their whole deal. But it does have a reminiscent quality to the Zell Miller giving up power voluntarily, but in this case, he had the opportunity over time with proper allies to get it back. I think he regretted what he did because there was more influence coming out of the second floor thereafter for a while. And by the time I came to work for him in '79, I think the compromise on the 2-term governor thing and no limits on lieutenant governor and those negotiations to get the power back made a huge difference in how he ran things. And I got to watch that up close for those 4 years, and it was interesting.
Similar also, I think, is the economic condition of the state.
Yes. From
when you were in the House and today.
Correct.
You had a special session, as I recall.
On the budget, absolutely. Uh-huh. We didn't realize the condition that we had when we first came aboard. But you remember there was an election in 1990, and in 1990, Miller was elected governor. Okay. There were only 3 of us in the House that were supporting Miller that year. Everybody else was either forced to support Bubba or they were supporting Johnny on the Republican ticket. I say forced to, they were encouraged to. Tom Murphy was very clear as to what he wanted without giving direct orders. It was a pretty unique, artful talent that he had. I don't think that's a good idea, boys. And that'd be pretty much the end of that. But when you have a budget crisis like that, you have an outgoing governor leaving no money in the reserves in the kitty, and then you have a downturn, yes, you're going to have to deal with some issues. I think this time around might be a little different in that the transition between the two governors is a lot more amicable, and it has less of that reserve robbing because we put some checks and balances in there after that occurrence before. But there are difficult decisions that have to be made in budget crises like that, and it tests the mettle of the leadership, but it also puts every member of the House and the Senate in an almost untenable position. You're forced under the balanced budget rule to have a balanced budget, but you're also telling your folks back home, I ain't raising your taxes. And then you have to go in there and you have to either cut folks, cut jobs, cut programs, or raise somebody's taxes, and it's very uncomfortable. And they're going to find that to be the case this time around as well.
One piece of legislation that I recall that you were very active in was the Solid Waste Management Act.
That's correct. Tires. We have an opportunity so rarely to deal with some environmental issues. We were facing a crisis. We were having some problems, and we needed to fund certain things that the environmental entities, and you recall back in the day, the regulator who was responsible for looking after protecting the environment and the guy issuing permits to businesses were two different people. And those were melded under the Reorganization Act of '72, and Miller actually pulled them back apart again ultimately once he became governor. But it was after some hue and cry, a lot of it contrived, but there was some degree. But the Solid Waste Management Act was an important element for us to address. We have finite real estate and a growing state. We have to manage our waste somehow. And for those of us who are on the Natural Resources Committee, we went and looked at the landfills. They said 5 years from now this will be filled and we can no longer add capacity. Here are the 15 other locations that are going to go offline in the next 15 years. What are you guys going to do about it? We have to permit things. We have to handle this solid waste, municipal waste. We have to handle sludge, all these things with toxins in it. Tires, you go through this entire list. So we had to get a handle on it, and we wrestled with a lot of knotty issues there. I'm not sure we totally solved some of the issues, but we at least got our arms around it and established a baseline to go forward.